Look in the mirror right now. If your eyes are green, you are looking at one of the rarest things on this entire planet. Rarer than being left-handed. Rarer than having red hair. Out of every 100 people walking past you on the street, maybe only 2 of them share the exact same thing you're seeing in your own reflection. For most of human history, nobody could explain why. People made up stories instead. They blamed witchcraft. They blamed hidden royal blood. They blamed cursed marriages and strange spirits, anything except the real answer. But today, scientists have finally traced this all the way back through our DNA. And what they discovered does not lead where anyone expected. It leads somewhere much older, somewhere far stranger, and the trail stretches all the way across the continent of Asia. Before we go further, if you have green eyes, or if you know someone who does, take a second to hit that subscribe button. This channel explores the hidden history hiding inside your own body, the kind of story that a regular ancestry test will never tell you. And there's a lot more of this coming. Now let's get into where green eyes truly come from. Let's start with the numbers, because they are honestly hard to believe. Brown eyes cover most of the human race. Something like 3 out of every 4 people on Earth have them, and in some parts of the world that number is even higher. Blue eyes are the famous minority, common across Northern Europe and scattered thinly everywhere else. But green eyes sit in a category of their own. Depending on which study you check, green eyes appear in only about 2% of the entire world's population, 2 people out of every 100. In some countries, you could walk through an entire city and never once see a green-eyed stranger. That rarity is exactly why so many myths grew around it for centuries. When something is that uncommon, people do not try to understand it. They try to explain it away with fear. And that is exactly what happened. All across the ancient world, green eyes were treated as something unnatural, and rarely in a good way. In parts of medieval Europe, a woman with green eyes risked being whispered about as a witch, simply because anything unusual was easy to be afraid of. In other places, green eyes became linked with jealousy and envy, which is part of the reason we still say someone is green with envy, or call jealousy the green-eyed monster, even today. Travelers told stories about green-eyed strangers as if they had met people from another world entirely. For thousands of years, that was the best explanation anyone had. When people cannot understand something, they wrap it in fear and folklore instead. It took modern genetics to finally strip all of that away, and what it uncovered turned out to be far more amazing than any old legend. It also helps to understand where green eyes actually show up most, because they are definitely not spread evenly across the map. The highest numbers on Earth are found in the north and west of Europe. In places like Ireland and Scotland, green eyes are far more common than the global average, with a large share of the population carrying them. As you travel through the rest of Europe, the numbers slowly drop off, and by the time you reach East Asia, Africa, or the Americas, green eyes become extremely rare. That uneven spread is not random at all. It is a direct trail left behind by an ancient mutation that traveled, spread, and mixed with nearly everyone it touched. In many ways, eye color is a quiet map of human migration written across billions of faces alive today. Now here's something that is about to change how you think about your own eyes. Green eyes are not actually green. There is no green pigment inside a human eye at all. None. Not a single trace of it. If you took a green eye apart and studied its chemistry piece by piece, you would never find any green coloring hiding inside. So how are you seeing green when you look in the mirror? The answer is one of the strangest tricks found anywhere in human biology, and once you understand it, you will never look at your own reflection quite the same way again. It all comes down to a substance called melanin. Melanin is the same pigment that colors your skin and your hair, and it also colors the front layer of your iris. But melanin really only exists in shades of brown and black. That is all it can do on its own. A large amount of melanin in the iris gives you dark brown eyes. A bit less, and you drift toward hazel or amber tones. And when there is very little melanin left at all, something completely different takes over. Light entering the eye gets scattered by the tissue itself, and the shorter blue wavelengths of that light bounce back out toward you. This is the exact same reason the sky looks blue, even though the air itself has no blue coloring in it whatsoever. The color is not a pigment. It is simply physics, light behaving in a very specific way as it passes through a very specific kind of tissue. Take a moment to really think about that, because it is genuinely strange. The front part of your iris is a see-through tissue, almost like a sheet of frosted glass. Behind that visible layer sits a much darker backing. When light enters your eye, it passes through that cloudy front layer and gets scattered along the way. The longer wavelengths, the reds and warm yellows, pass through and get absorbed by the darker layer sitting behind it. But the shorter blue wavelengths bounce straight back out toward whoever is looking at you. So a person with blue eyes is not showing you a blue substance at all. They are showing you scattered light, using the exact same trick of physics that paints the sky above us every single day. Every blue eye and every green eye on this planet is, in a very real sense, carrying around a tiny piece of the sky. That scattering effect is what creates blue eyes on its own. So where does green fit into all of this? Green is the middle ground. Green eyes happen when you have that same blue scattering effect, but with a thin extra layer of a yellowish pigment called lipochrome sitting right on top of it. Blue light from the scattering combines with a soft wash of golden yellow from the lipochrome, and your brain blends the two together into what you see as green. You are essentially looking at a living optical illusion. A hint of yellow, a scatter of blue, and an extremely precise amount of melanin that has to land within a very narrow range. Too much melanin, and you end up with brown eyes. Too little, and you end up with pure blue. Green only shows up when everything lines up almost perfectly. That is a huge part of why it is so uncommon. Nature has to thread a very fine needle for it to happen at all. And this is the key difference between green and blue that most people never realize. Blue eyes are basically the result of something missing. Take away enough melanin, let the light scattering effect take over, and you get blue. It is almost the natural outcome of very low pigment levels. Green demands much more than that. It needs that same low pigment level, but it also needs that exact dusting of golden lipochrome. And it needs the melanin to stop at a very specific halfway point instead of dropping all the way down to nearly nothing. That is why blue eyes can be common across entire countries, while green eyes stay rare even in the very places where they show up most often. Blue is a single ingredient. Green is a full recipe, and it has to be followed almost perfectly every single time, or you end up with a completely different result. Which brings us to the real question. If green eyes are just this delicate mix of light and pigment, why do some people have them while most people don't? What actually decides it? The answer is written directly into your DNA in a stretch of genetic code that most people have never even heard of. And this is where the story starts to get truly fascinating. Hidden inside your chromosomes is a small region that scientists have studied intensely for the past 20 years. Two genes are mainly responsible here. The first is called OCA2, and you can think of it as the body's melanin factory. OCA2 helps control how much pigment your body sends into the iris. The second gene is called HERC2, and this one is the real key to the whole story. HERC2 does not actually create any pigment on its own. Instead, it acts like a control switch sitting right beside OCA2, turning that melanin factory up or down as needed. A tiny change inside HERC2 can quietly turn the entire system down, telling the body to produce far less pigment than it normally would. And when researchers went looking for the true origin of light-colored eyes, this exact switch is what they found. To really understand how strange this discovery was, picture what these scientists were actually doing. They were reading through an entire genetic code, letter by letter, hunting for the single spot where light-eyed people differed from dark-eyed people. The human genome is billions of letters long, an almost unimaginably huge instruction manual. And yet, when researchers finally zeroed in on the exact region controlling eye color, the difference came down to a change so small that you could easily miss it. One tiny tweak in the code, right inside the switch that controls the melanin factory, dialing pigment production down just enough to change how a person's eyes reflect light. Here is where things get almost unbelievable. A team of geneticists based in Copenhagen spent years comparing the DNA of light-eyed people from completely different corners of the world. People separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years of history. And what they discovered stopped them in their tracks. Nearly every single one of these people carried the exact same tiny genetic switch, in the exact same location, changed in the exact same way. Not similar changes, the identical change, down to the very same letter of DNA. And there's really only one explanation for something like that. Every single one of them inherited it from the very same person, one individual, one ancestor who lived long before any written history existed, whose DNA quietly passed itself down through generation after generation and never disappeared. Take a second to really sit with that. If you have light-colored eyes, you're almost certainly carrying a mutation that traces back to one single human being. A person who lived somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, most likely near the shores of the Black Sea, in the region where Eastern Europe meets Asia. This person was not royalty. There were no kings back then, no thrones, no empires. Just farmers, herders, and small communities scraping out a living from the land. But one of them was born with a small error in the melanin switch, an error that softened the color in their eyes. And instead of disappearing, that error spread. It traveled down through the generations, across entire continents, through wars, migrations, and famines, all the way to the face you see staring back at you in the mirror today. This is not a loose guess or a poetic exaggeration. It is simply the logic of DNA itself. When a genetic change appears independently in many different places, it usually looks slightly different every time, because random mutations almost never land on the exact same spot in the exact same way twice. But when the change is completely identical everywhere researchers look, down to the individual letter, the only reasonable explanation left is that it happened once in one person, and was passed down to everyone who carries it today. That is the signature of a single shared ancestor. One person, one moment, one small copying mistake in the machinery of life, echoing across 10,000 years and hundreds of generations until it finally reached you. We will never know that person's name. We will never know if they were a man or a woman, admired or feared for looking slightly different from everyone around them. They left behind no monument, no writing, nothing at all, except a quiet trace hidden inside the genetic code that has outlasted every empire built after them. But every single time a green-eyed or blue-eyed baby opens their eyes for the very first time, that ancient stranger is remembered in the only way that truly lasts. Not carved in stone, but carried in living tissue. That is a kind of lasting legacy that no king could ever buy. And yet, it was given for free to a nameless farmer who probably never traveled more than a few miles from the place they were born. Now, blue eyes are actually the simpler version of this story, because blue mostly comes down to that one single genetic switch. Green is a bit more complicated, and honestly, a lot more interesting. Green eyes still need that same reduction in melanin, but they also need extra ingredients working together. The exact amount of pigment, the added lipochrome layer, and the fine-tuning of several genes acting at once. So green did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of that same ancient mutation from the Black Sea region, and was then shaped further as different populations mixed, traveled, and adapted to new environments. In a way, green eyes are a record of movement. They represent what happens when that original mutation traveled far from home and combined with new genetics along the way. And where did that journey lead? East, deep into the heart of Asia. But before we follow that path, we need to answer a question that puzzled scientists for decades. Why did this mutation even survive in the first place? A change that reduces pigment does not obviously make anyone stronger, faster, or better at finding food. In pure survival terms, light-colored eyes should have simply faded out as a rare quirk. Instead, they spread across an entire hemisphere. So what kept the trait alive? There are a few leading theories, and they might all be true at the same time. The first involves sunlight. As humans moved north and east into regions with weaker sunlight and long, dark winters, lighter features may have traveled together with lighter skin, which helps the body produce vitamin D even in low light conditions. Eye color and skin color share some of the same genetic pathways, so lighter eyes may have simply come along for the ride with a trait that had nothing to do with vision at all. The second theory is a bit more human, and honestly more fun. Rare things stand out. In small, ancient communities where nearly everyone had dark eyes, someone with striking light or green eyes would have been noticed immediately. They would have been remembered. And being remembered has always played a role in passing genes forward to the next generation. Over enough generations, simply being memorable can become its own kind of advantage. The truth is probably a mix of both ideas, a little bit of biology and a little bit of human attraction. So now we have the origin story. A single ancestor near the Black Sea, a mutation that reduced pigment in the human eye, and a combination of forces that kept it alive long enough to spread across the world. Now let's follow it on a journey that most people have never heard of, because the story of green eyes does not stay in Europe. It moves in the opposite direction entirely. About 5,000 years ago, waves of herders from the grasslands north of the Black Sea began moving outward in every direction. These were people who had tamed the horse and who lived and traveled across vast open plains, carrying their genetics with them like seeds scattered on the wind. Some of them pushed west into Europe, but others turned east and south, moving into Central Asia, crossing land routes that would one day become the great trade paths of the ancient world. They carried their language, their tools, their animals, and yes, the light-eye mutation as well. As they settled among the people already living in these new lands, that mutation began showing up in places nobody would expect to find it. We now have a fairly clear picture of who these steppe travelers were. They were tough, mobile, and relentless, pushing into new territory generation after generation, blending with the people they encountered and passing their genetics steadily forward. Their impact on the human family tree is almost impossible to overstate. Enormous portions of modern populations across both Europe and Asia still carry traces of this single ancient expansion out of the grasslands. So when the light-eye mutation spread outward, it did not creep slowly like a rumor passed quietly between neighbors. It surged outward on horseback, carried by one of the most successful human migrations in history. Fast forward a couple of thousand years, and this entire region became connected by the Silk Road. This was not a single road, but a huge network of routes linking China all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, running straight through the heart of Central Asia. For over 1,000 years, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and travelers moved back and forth along these routes, and wherever people trade, people also mix. Genes traveled along the Silk Road just as surely as silk fabric and spices did. Light eyes, once a rare trait from the western grasslands, spread into the mountain valleys and desert regions of Asia and settled there permanently. And in a few isolated pockets, cut off from the outside world by mountains and long distances, that trait became trapped and concentrated, which is exactly how you end up with something extraordinary. Deep in the mountains of northern Pakistan, in a remote area known as the Kailash Valley, there lives a small community of people who look strikingly different from their neighbors. Fair skin, light hair, and remarkably often, green and blue eyes. For generations, outsiders had a favorite explanation for this. The story went that these were the descendants of Alexander the Great's army, soldiers who marched east more than 2,000 years ago and never returned home, leaving their light-eyed bloodline behind in the mountains. It is a beautiful story, and one that tour guides and travel blogs still repeat today. But here's the twist. When geneticists finally tested the DNA of the Kailash people, that romantic legend mostly fell apart. The real truth turned out to be even older than Alexander himself. The Kailash are not the descendants of a Greek army at all. They appear to be an ancient, deeply isolated population, whose lineage split off from other groups thousands of years before Alexander was even born. Their light eyes did not come from a handful of wandering soldiers. They came from that same deep well of ancient Western Eurasian ancestry. The same stream that carried the light eye mutation eastward out of the grasslands long before any empire ever existed. In other words, their green eyes are not a souvenir left behind by a famous conqueror. They are a living fossil, a trait preserved through mountain isolation for so long that it has outlasted the very civilizations people once tried to credit it to. The legend got the drama right, but it got the history wrong. The real story is quieter, older, and far more impressive. And the Kailash are not alone in this. Travel through the mountain valleys of Central and South Asia, and you will keep finding these same kinds of pockets. In the Hunza Valley, in parts of Afghanistan, and in the highlands of Nuristan and Chitral, green and light-colored eyes appear far more often than anyone would expect for that part of the world. Each of these communities acts as a kind of time capsule, holding on to a genetic echo that arrived thousands of years ago and became locked in place, protected by the very mountains that kept the outside world at a distance. When you see a green-eyed child in one of these valleys, you are not looking at some strange exception. You are looking at the endpoint of one of the longest genetic journeys in human history. And what makes these places so valuable to scientists is exactly how isolated they were. In a busy, well-connected region, a rare trait usually gets diluted. It blends into the wider population and slowly fades away over time. But wall off a community behind steep mountain passes and rushing rivers, have people marry mostly within the same group for century after century. And a trait that arrived long ago gets locked firmly into place instead. It stops fading and starts concentrating. These isolated valleys became accidental laboratories, preserving a slice of ancient ancestry that the rest of the world blended away long ago. For scientists studying the deep human past, communities like these are living archives of history. There is one face from this region that the whole world already recognizes, even if most people never learned the science behind it. In the mid-1980s, a photographer captured a portrait of a young Afghan girl inside a refugee camp, and her striking green eyes ended up on the cover of one of the most famous magazines in the world. That single photograph became one of the most recognized images ever taken. People were captivated by those eyes, and for years, nobody could quite explain why the image hit so hard. Part of the answer is simply that green eyes are rare enough to feel almost otherworldly. But the deeper answer is the very story we have been building this entire time. Those eyes were the visible tip of an invisible history, a mutation that began near the Black Sea, traveled east across the grasslands, moved down the Silk Road, and finally appeared in the face of a child in the mountains of Central Asia. She was not an exception to the story, she was the story itself. So let's bring all of this back to you. If you are watching this with green eyes of your own, what does it actually mean? It means you are carrying something genuinely ancient somewhere in your family history, going back further than any name you know, further than any old photograph, further than any country that exists on a modern map. One of your ancestors picked up that original light eye mutation, and against incredible odds, it survived. It made it through thousands of years of chance, through countless generations, where it could have simply vanished forever. Every green-eyed person alive today is proof that it did not disappear. And here's the part that ties everything together, the part that surprises almost everyone who hears it. That mutation does not care about the borders we treat as so important today. It does not care whether your family is European, Central Asian, Middle Eastern, or a mix of all three. The exact same tiny genetic switch shows up in a fishing village in Denmark, and in a mountain valley in Pakistan, in Turkey, and in Ireland, in Afghanistan, and in Scotland. Green eyes are one of the clearest reminders we have that the neat categories we use to divide people are far younger and far shallower than the DNA running underneath them. Beneath the surface, we are far more connected than most of us ever realize. A green-eyed woman in the Kailash Valley and a green-eyed man in rural Ireland are, in a very real and literal sense, distant cousins, both carrying a gift passed down from the very same forgotten ancestor. This is also why a simple ancestry test can feel amazing and frustrating at the exact same time. It might tell you that you are some blend of a handful of regions, a neat little pie chart with tidy percentages, but it rarely tells you the deeper story, the actual journey your traits took to finally reach you. Your green eyes are the perfect example of this. A test might flag some European ancestry and stop right there, never once mentioning that the exact same mutation is sitting in mountain villages thousands of miles to the east, or that it all began with a single person on the edge of Asia, long before Europe as we know it today even existed. The percentages you see are just the surface. The real inheritance is the story buried underneath them, and that is the part almost nobody ever gets to hear. Now, there are a few more interesting things worth knowing about green eyes while we are here, because this trait comes with some fascinating side effects. Because green eyes contain less melanin than brown ones, they let a bit more light pass through, which can make them slightly more sensitive to bright sunlight. That is not a flaw at all. It is simply the same low pigment feature that makes them so striking, showing up in a different way. There's also ongoing research looking into subtle links between eye color and other traits, although that science is still fairly young, and you should be cautious of anyone claiming that your eye color determines your personality. What we can say with real confidence is the deeper part of the story, of the ancestry, the migration, and the shared origin. That part is solid, and honestly, it is remarkable enough all on its own. Here is one more quirk worth knowing before we finish. Many green-eyed people were not actually born with green eyes at all. A large number of babies arrive in the world with grayish or bluish eyes because the melanin in their iris has not fully developed yet. Over the first few months of life, and sometimes even the first couple of years, the pigment slowly fills in and the final eye color settles into place. So a baby who starts out looking blue-eyed can gradually shift toward green as that thin layer of lipochrome and pigment finishes forming. In a very real way, you can watch this ancient genetic recipe complete itself right on a baby's face in real time.